Louis L'Amour speaks about the town of Deadwood and some personalities of the Old West.
Deadwood, South Dakota was a wild boom camp that opened up in the Black Hills after the Indians were pushed out. There's a lot of dispute about the Black Hills right now, about who they belong to and everything, but as a matter of fact, it's very doubtful whether any Indian tribe had much of a claim on them. The Kiowas had them for a while, and the Sioux drove the Kiowas out, and the Sioux now claim that they were pushed out by the white man and wanted to be paid for. But why not pay the Kiowas? The Sioux drove out, and the Kiowas drove somebody else out. This was the way of things. But Deadwood was a boom camp that started there. Some of Custer's men, when they were exploring the Black Hills, found gold. And they found gold in several places, but Deadwood was where they found most of it. It started around a group of mines, or a mine in particular, and it did sprawl along that whole kind of canyon there. And there was a lot of dead wood up in the side of one of the hills, knocked down by, I imagine, by wind. That'll do it occasionally. I know a place in Colorado was a whole forest lying on the side of the hill. The sudden wind blew all the trees down. But anyway, Deadwood was very, very famous for that. And Deadwood burst into growth out of nowhere. Buildings and tent houses and everything sprang up along the street. And then the people began coming in, the gamblers and the women, and the men who were doing the mining and the men who were trying to take the money away from those who brought it out of the ground. And Deadwood was rough and tough. That was where Hickok was killed some time later, shot in the back. There was a sheriff around there for a while named Seth Bullock. He was quite a well-known man. He was a merchant later in Montana. But he was not a gunfighter at all, just a stern, quiet man who knew his business and went about it and was very highly respected. Calamity Jane was around there for a while, but Calamity Jane was really nobody in the West. The only thing she's remembered for is because she had that tricky name. She was a prostitute of a particularly low order and not good-looking enough to do much business in town, so she did her business out on the road with traveling wagon trains. But it was wild and rough, and at one time or another, nearly all the gunfighters showed up there. There was a very well-known gunfighter at that time who's been forgotten pretty much since, named Boone May. He was a police officer there, deputy sheriff, I should say, and probably as good with a gun as any of the others that you've heard about. But he did acquire the reputation. It was a wild, rough town. There was a very good book written about it by a woman named Estelle Bennett, whose father was a judge there, who had quite a fine library. And he handled a lot of the cases there in town. And Estelle Bennett was a little girl growing up there when all this was going on. She tells a good account of it. See, sometimes people wonder how we know about what happened in the West. They think you have to have a good imagination. You don't, because there were people there at the time who were writing down what happened. You don't have to imagine, you know. There are diaries every place, and nearly every town had its newspaper. Some had two. They were recording the facts right at the time. You know all about these people. You can check everything right from beginning to end. What you have to understand is that there were generally two sections in any western town. There was the people on the wrong side of the tracks, you might say, the saloons and the red light district and all that, and that's where most of the rough stuff went on. At the same time this was happening, at the same time the gunfights were going on and everything, on the other side of the track, there were churches and schools and people going on, carrying on their lives the way any normal people would. And sometimes all they knew about the gunfights was the sound of the gunfire. They didn't know who was shooting who until they heard it later. But among the rougher crowd and among the cowboys in the neighborhood, gunfighters were treated about like baseball stars or football stars now. People talked about their various abilities and what would happen if two of them came together and who would be better than who, you know. And this was a discussion that went on quite often. It was rough, very rough. And the saloons in those days were not just a place where you went to drink. They were clearinghouses for information. Many of the men who went to saloons didn't drink at all. But you would go in there, and there at the bar or at the card tables, you could get information on any part of the country or anybody you wanted to know. If you want to know about the marshal in a certain town, you could ask somebody there would always know, or they'd always know where a trail was. And if you happen to be a little bit careful about it and listen a lot and ask questions very discreetly, you could find out where the outlaw hideouts were, because there was always somebody around who knew. And you see, actually, the West was a relatively small place. It was huge in area, but there weren't many people. And when a cattle driver, for example, started in Texas to go north to Dodge City or Abilene or Ogallala, Nebraska, wherever they were going, a man would sit down and draw a trail for them in the dust or the clay, or maybe on a piece of paper in a bar room, and show them where they had to go. And usually he would tell them also about the town marshal in this various towns. He'd tell them about Wild Billy Cock or Mysterious Dave Mathers, somebody like that, and how they had to be careful with this man. He was dangerous. So it was relatively a small world, and there was really no place to hide in the West. Once you got out there and people knew you, by some name or other, and they never asked you what your name was. If you told them a name, you could say, I'm Shorty. That was all they ever recognized you by. Or if you said your name was Mr. John B. Ellison, they just accepted that. They didn't ask what your background was or where you came from or who you were or where you went to school, anything. They just took you on your own word. You came around a ranch and stopped by for some food or something, what they used to call riding the grub line. You could stop at any ranch, and any ranch would feed you. So nobody asked you your name or anything. If you wanted to volunteer, that was up to you. If you had some distinction, they might refer to you by that. They might call you Red or Shorty or Slim. I was on a circus briefly where there were about 5 or 6 Shorties and 7 or 8 Slims. So they got to designate them as Overland Slim and Red Slim and that sort of thing. All kinds of people came west, some of them with pretty bad records behind them. The West was a natural magnet for any adventurer, any drifter, anybody who was at loose ends. So men came there from all over the world, not just from America, but from other countries as well. They came there from Australia, from France, from England. We had a man up in North Dakota called the Marquis de Moors, who built a chateau out in the western plains and ran cattle out there. A very handsome man. He even got in a couple of gun battles. But he was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt also, or at least they were acquainted. And there were others came. For example, a little-known fact is that 5 of the men who died with Custer at the Little Bighorn had been members of the Vatican Guard.
Whoa.
You never knew who you were talking to in the West. Once up in, I think it was in Idaho, there were some miners sitting around a table, and one of them had brought a newspaper into the area. And newspapers are very rare and hard to come by. So he was reading the paper aloud to all these miners while they were eating. And he was reading everything to them because it was all news to them. And he came to an account of the rowing match between Cambridge and Oxford on the Thames River. And one man sitting down at the end of the table looked up and said, I used to row on that team. And he had. You see, but you never knew who you were talking to. There were people out there who were titled men. For example, we have a senator in Washington right now who is a descendant of a titled man, Senator Wallop. Oliver Wallop came over here from England and ranched in the plains of Wyoming for 30 years, and then went back and took a seat in the House of Lords. So you never knew who you were talking to. But Texas, due to the kind of country it was, developing very rapidly, and with the men who were fiercely proud and fiercely independent, naturally gravitated toward use of guns. There were outlaws, there were Indians, everybody had carried a gun from necessity. Even children going to school did. Actually, many of the gunfighters were very young. If a man lived, we say, 35 years old as a gunfighter, usually he lived forever, or for a long, long time. But the fellows who were in most of the gunfights were anywhere from 17 to 25. After that, they began to realize that they were vulnerable too, and they began to be more careful about their gun battles. But they were mostly young. There was no such thing really as a juvenile delinquent in those days. A boy went right from being a boy in knee pants to being a man. And that's what he wanted to be more than anything else in the world. He wanted to be a man and be accepted as a man and walk among a man and do a man's work. And that was the important thing for him. So as soon as he got to that point, he had established himself to a degree. And he was very proud of the fact that he had. But some of them went overboard, and some of them became killers and became very vicious. And if you were old enough to carry a gun, you were old enough to get shot. It was your problem. There's a case I used in one of my stories. I used it in a story called Bendigo Shafter. All the kids coming to school used to hang their guns up in the cloakroom because they were miles from home sometimes, and it was dangerous to ride out without a gun. And this is taken from an actually true incident. The incident, I use it in my story and tell the story, but it really happened, that a man came to kill the teacher who was a man, and he came with a gun, and all the kids liked the teachers, so they came out and ranged around him with their guns. And that stopped it. But kids 12 and 13 used to carry guns to school regularly.
And